is the largest lake on Earth. It holds more water than all the freshwater lakes of the world combined. %40 of every lake on the planet gathered into a single body between Europe and Asia. And it is also a sea. Salt runs through it. It has waves that can sink ships, storms that took weeks to cross, and a fleet of warships still patrolling it today. For nearly 30 years, 5 nations sat at the same table and could not agree on the one thing a child could ask. Is it a lake or is it a sea? The question sounds like a riddle. It is not. It is worth, by some measures, trillions of dollars, because beneath this water lie some of the richest oil and gas reserves on Earth. And the answer to that simple question, lake or sea, decides who owns them. If it is a lake, the law says you split it 5 ways, equal shares, 20% each. If it is a sea, a different law applies. You divide it by the length of your coastline, and some nations have a great deal more coastline than others. So for 3 decades, the map stayed blank. The oil stayed in the ground, or it didn't. The borders ran out from the shore and then simply stopped, in open water, where no one could say whose was whose. 5 flags, 1 body of water, and a line down the middle that nobody could draw. This is the Caspian, the most contested sea that by the strictest definition is not a sea at all. Look at it from above, and the scale is hard to hold. It runs more than 1,000 kilometers from north to south, longer than the distance from London to Rome. Its surface covers an area larger than Germany, larger than Japan. 5 countries touch it: Russia and Kazakhstan along the north, Turkmenistan to the east, Iran across the south, and Azerbaijan to the west. 3 of them did not exist as independent nations 40 years ago, and that, more than anything, is why the line could never be drawn. But to understand the argument, you have to understand the water itself, because the Caspian is not a lake that someone decided to call a sea. It is the opposite. It is a sea that became a lake, and never quite let go of what it was. Around 50 million years ago, this place was open ocean. It was part of a vast prehistoric sea that geologists call the paratethys, a body of water so large it dwarfed every lake that has ever existed since. It connected at its edges to the Atlantic and to the Pacific. It was salt. It was alive. And it stretched across what is now the heart of 2 continents. Then the continents moved. The slow collision that pushed up the Alps and the Caucasus Mountains began to cut the inland water off from the open ocean. Land rose, sea levels fell, and around 5.5 million years ago, the paratethys was severed from the world's oceans for the last time. What remained drained and shrank and broke apart. The Black Sea was one fragment. The Aral Sea, far to the east, was another, and the largest piece of all settled into a deep basin and stayed there. The Caspian is what is left of that ocean, a piece of a vanished sea marooned in the middle of a continent, and the salt in it is old salt, fossil salt, left behind when the ocean was cut off. Its water is roughly 1/3 as salty as the sea, fresher in the north, where rivers pour in, saltier in the south. But it is salt all the same. the signature of a sea that has been gone for 5 million years. It sits today 28 meters below the level of the world's oceans, a body of water in a hole with no way out. That is the part that matters most. The Caspian has no outlet. No river runs from it to the sea. More than 130 rivers run in, and not one runs out. The water that enters can leave only one way, by rising into the air. Evaporation is the sea's only door. And one river feeds it above all others. The Volga, descending out of the Russian heartland, supplies roughly 80% of all the water the Caspian receives. The longest river in Europe, emptying its entire weight into a sea with no shore to the wider world. So this is the thing the 5 nations are arguing over. Not a pond, not a sea in the ordinary sense, a fragment of a 50-million-year-old ocean fed by the rivers of a continent, holding within it more oil than almost anywhere on the planet, and a kind of life that exists nowhere else on Earth. The numbers beneath the water are difficult to take in. The Caspian Basin holds tens of billions of barrels of oil and some of the largest natural gas reserves on the planet, enough, by some estimates, to supply a continent for decades. Whole national economies stand on it. Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. Each depends on what lies under this sea for the wealth that holds the country together. This is why a question about a single word became a question about survival. When you argue over whether the Caspian is a sea or a lake, you are not arguing about geography. You are arguing over who gets to keep the thing their entire future is built on. No wonder it took 30 years. To see why it is worth fighting over, you have to go to the western shore, to the city built on fire, Baku. The capital of Azerbaijan sits on a thumb of land that pushes out into the Caspian, the Absheron Peninsula. And for as long as anyone has written things down, this peninsula has been burning. Natural gas seeps up through the ground here and ignites. Flames rise straight out of bare rock and do not go out. The ancient Zoroastrians, who worshipped fire, built temples on this spot and made pilgrimages to it across thousands of kilometers. They believed the fire was sacred. They were standing, without knowing it, on one of the largest oil fields in the world. In the 13th century, the traveler Marco Polo passed through the Caucasus and heard of a spring near here that gushed oil, not in cupfuls, but in quantities so vast, he wrote, that 100 ships could load from it at once. It was not good to eat, he noted, but it burned. For centuries, the oil was scooped from hand-dug pits and carried away in skins, used for lamps and for medicine. And then, in the middle of the 19th century, everything changed. 1846. On a low hill south of Baku, at a place called Bibi Haybat, a Russian engineer sinks a well into the ground using a mechanical drill. It strikes oil. That well is drilled 13 years before the famous well in Pennsylvania that the history books usually call the beginning of the oil age. The age of oil does not begin in America. It begins here, on the shore of the Caspian. What follows is one of the strangest industrial booms the world has ever seen. In 1873, a Swede named Robert Nobel arrives in Baku. He has come to buy walnut wood, timber for the stocks of rifles being made in a factory back in Russia. He has money in his pocket for the lumber. He never buys it. Instead, he catches the oil fever sweeping the city, and he spends the money on a small refinery. His brother Ludwig follows, and the Nobels Yes, that family, the family whose name would later be carved onto the most famous prizes in the world, build an oil empire on the Caspian. Ludwig solves the problem no one else could. How do you move an ocean of oil across the sea? He builds the world's first oil tanker, a steel ship called the Zoroaster, and launches it onto the Caspian in 1878. Before long, hundreds of tankers crowd these waters. The French banking house of Rothschild arrives, British capital pours in, and by the turn of the 20th century, this single city on this single shore is producing more oil than the entire United States. 1901. Baku pumps roughly half of all the oil in the world. Half. From a forest of wooden derricks crammed into a few square miles of black, soaked earth.
They called the district
the Black City. The ground was black, the air was black. The workers came home with oil soaked into their skin and their clothes. And the wealth did not reach them. The men who pulled the oil from the ground lived in squalor, while fortunes were shipped west. In 1905, the resentment boiled over into violence. Strikes, then riots, then massacres between the Armenian and Azeri communities crowded into the oil quarters. Hundreds died in the streets of the richest industrial town in the empire. A young revolutionary worked those oil fields in those years, organizing the strikes, running a secret printing press hidden in the back streets. His name then was Josip Djugashvili. The world would come to know him as Stalin. The boom did not last. War came, revolution came. The oil fields were seized and nationalized, the foreign owners driven out, the Nobel's company swallowed whole. But the lesson of Baku never faded. Whoever holds this shore holds something the modern world cannot live without. Walk through Baku today, and the oil is harder to see, but it is everywhere underneath. The old town, İçerişehir, the walled heart of the city, still stands, its lanes winding past the Maiden Tower, a stone cylinder on the shore whose true purpose no one has ever fully explained. Around it, a new Baku has risen on a second tide of oil money. 3 glass towers, shaped like flames, now dominate the skyline. They are lit at night to look like fire pouring up the side of the buildings, a modern echo of the sacred flames the Zoroastrians once crossed continents to see. But the most important thing Baku built in the new century cannot be seen from the city at all. It runs west, underground, for more than 1,700 kilometers. When the Soviet Union fell, Azerbaijan's oil had only one way out, through Russian pipelines on Russian terms. So Azerbaijan, with Western backing, built another road. A pipeline carrying Caspian oil from Baku across Georgia all the way to the Mediterranean coast of Turkey, bypassing Russia entirely and bypassing Iran. It was a quiet revolution. For the first time, the wealth of the Caspian could reach the world without passing through Moscow's hands, and it turned a regional argument over a body of water into something the great powers of the world cared about very much. Pipelines, it turned out, were never only engineering. They were the question of who the Caspian's oil belonged to, drawn across the map in steel. And that is the shadow under everything that follows. When 5 nations sit down to argue over where the borders run, they are not arguing about water. They are arguing about what lies beneath it. But the Caspian is not only oil. Cross to its southern shore, and you find something almost no one outside the region expects. Most people picture Iran as desert, dust and stone and heat, a dry country under a hard sun. And most of it is. But along the Caspian, pressed between the water and the wall of the Alborz Mountains, lies a strip of Iran that breaks every rule. The Iranians call it simply Shomal, the north, and it is green. Rain falls here in quantities the rest of the country never sees, up to 2,000 millimeters a year. The mountains trap the moisture rising off the sea and wring it out over the lowland. The result is a forest older than almost any other in the world. They are called the Hyrcanian forests. They are relics of a vanished age, woodland that survived the ice ages here in this sheltered band when it was wiped out everywhere else in the region. Beech and oak and ironwood, dripping with mist, climbing the mountain slopes. A living museum, tens of millions of years old, that the world only recently thought to protect. And below the forest, the land is worked the way it has been worked for centuries. Rice paddies terrace the lowland, mirror bright. In the town of Lahijan, tea bushes cover the hills, the heart of Iran's tea country, where the leaves are still picked by hand. The air is humid and soft. The roofs are red clay. In summer, it is 10–15 degrees cooler here than in the deserts a few hundred kilometers south. This is the other Iran, the one that does not appear on the postcards. A coast of rice and tea and rain, where the people speak their own languages. Gilaki, Mazandarani, older cousins of Persian, kept alive in the valleys. The same sea that made one shore a city of oil made this shore a garden. The water gives, and it gives differently to everyone who lives along it. And once, this forest held a king, the Caspian tiger. It lived in these woods and the reed beds around the sea, one of the largest cats that ever walked the earth, a tiger of the cold north, hunting wild boar through the Hyrcanian shade. It is gone now. The last of them vanished in the second half of the 20th century, hunted and squeezed out as the forests were cleared and the land was farmed. The apex predator of the Caspian shore exists today only in old photographs and in the memory of the species it left behind. The leopard still holds on in these mountains, the brown bear, the lynx, but the tiger that once owned this coast is a ghost. The first great loss the Caspian would suffer in modern times. It would not be the last. To understand what else is at stake, follow the water north, to where the greatest of the rivers arrives. In the far north, the Volga reaches the end of its long journey and breaks apart. It does not meet the sea as a single mouth. It shatters into a delta, a maze of hundreds of channels and islands spreading across the flat land, a wilderness of reeds and water and birds. This is where 80% of the Caspian's water finally arrives. And around it grew one of the great trading cities of the Russian south, Astrakhan. Astrakhan has guarded this river mouth for centuries. It was once the seat of a Tatar Khanate, then taken by Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, becoming Russia's Great Southern Gate, the place where the empire met the trade routes of Persia and the East. Caravans and ships met here. Goods from India and Iran came up the Volga from this point into the heart of Russia. That role has never entirely faded. Even now, a trade corridor is being built along these waters, a route running from Russia, down the Caspian, through Astrakhan and Baku, to the Iranian shore and onward toward the Indian Ocean. The old road between north and south, redrawn for a new century. And on the dry steppe just west of the delta lies one of the more unexpected places in all of Europe. Kalmykia, a Russian republic on the northwestern shore of the Caspian, and the only corner of the European continent where Buddhism is the traditional faith. Its people are the descendants of Mongol nomads who migrated here centuries ago and never left. Temples with golden roofs rise out of the flat grassland, prayer flags snapping in the wind off the sea. A piece of the Asian steppe settled on the edge of Europe, on the shore of a sea that belongs fully to neither. Where the fresh water of the river meets the salt water of the sea, the conditions are perfect for one creature above all. A fish that has outlived almost everything else on the planet. The sturgeon. It is not an exaggeration to call it a living fossil. Sturgeon have swum these waters, in one form or another, for 250 million years. They were here before the dinosaurs rose. They were here when the dinosaurs fell. They watched the Paratethers close and the Caspian form around them, and they kept swimming. The largest of them is the beluga sturgeon. It can live 100 years. It can grow longer than a car and heavier than a horse. And inside the females, it carries the thing that would nearly destroy the entire species: caviar. The unfertilized eggs of the sturgeon, salt-cured, became the most expensive food on Earth. Russian tsars served it. When the aristocracy fled the revolution, they carried the taste to Paris, and from there, it conquered the dining rooms of the West. A single kilogram of the finest beluga roe can sell for thousands of dollars. The Caspian holds, or held, 90% of the world's wild sturgeon. For a time, that wealth seemed endless. It was not. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the careful Soviet controls on fishing collapsed with it. The single authority that had managed the sturgeon split overnight into separate nations, separate borders, separate police forces who did not talk to each other. Into that gap poured the poachers. The fish that had survived 250 million years was gutted for the eggs inside it. The females were caught and slit open and thrown back dead. Within a few decades, the population fell by 90%. Whole age classes of the great old fish simply vanished from the sea. January 2006. In Geneva, the international body that governs trade in endangered species does the only thing left to do. It bans the global trade in wild Caspian caviar. The most valuable wild harvest in the world is shut down because there is almost nothing left to harvest. A creature that outlasted the dinosaurs was brought to the edge of extinction in the span of a single human lifetime. In the Kazakh port of Aktau, on the eastern shore, an ecologist named Adilbek Kozybakov remembers his childhood. His mother kept a jar of caviar in the refrigerator. Each morning, she spooned it onto bread for the children. She believed it kept them healthy. It was ordinary. It was everywhere. Today, in the shops of Aktau, there is no natural caviar left to buy. The sturgeon is not the only creature that calls this sea its only home. Out in the open water lives a mammal that has no business being here at all. The Caspian seal. It is the only marine mammal in the entire sea, and one of the smallest seals in the world. It is found nowhere else on the planet, and how it came to be here is one of the stranger stories in the Caspian. Its ancestors were Arctic seals. Around 2 million years ago, in a colder age, they followed the ice in the rivers south, down from the polar north, and arrived in this inland sea. Then, the world warmed. The corridor of cold water closed behind them, and the seals were trapped, marooned, like the sea itself, a piece of the Arctic stranded in the middle of a warm continent. They adapted. They survived. For 2 million years, They have hauled out onto the winter ice of the northern Caspian to give birth, raising their pups on a frozen sea 1,000 kilometers from any ocean. There were once 1 million of them. Now there are a fraction of that. Hunting, pollution, nets, and the slow warming of the sea have taken them down year after year. And the ice they need to breed on is forming later and thinner, and in some winters, barely forming at all. An Arctic animal in a sea that is getting warmer, in a country with no Arctic left to retreat to. The sea gives life to more than the creatures that swim in it. Twice a year, the Caspian becomes a vast crossroads in the sky. Millions of birds funnel along its shores on the great migration routes between the Arctic and Africa. The reed beds of the Volga Delta and the lagoons of the Iranian coast fill with them. Flamingos wading the shallows, pelicans, geese, and ducks in numbers that darken the water. The wetlands here are among the most important resting grounds for migratory birds anywhere between two continents. It is no accident that the world's first great treaty to protect wetlands was signed on this very coast. In 1971, in the Iranian Caspian town of Ramsar, nations gathered and agreed to safeguard the marshes and lagoons that waterbirds depend on. Today, protected wetlands all over the planet are still called Ramsar sites, named for a small resort town on the shore of this sea. Few of the people who use the name know where it comes from. It comes from here. And around these famous animals lives a hidden population almost no one notices, the small, ancient survivors of the old ocean. The Caspian still carries creatures from its days as the paratethys, tiny crustaceans, shrimp-like amphipods, and small shellfish that exist in this sea and no other. Relics that have drifted in these waters since before there was a Caspian to call it home. Scientists count more than 300 kinds of invertebrate found nowhere else on Earth. They are the true natives, older than the seals, older than the cities, older than the borders, the last living thread connecting this lake back to the ocean it used to be. The argument over the Caspian was never only about the oil of the western shore. The eastern shore holds its own enormous prize. Along the coast of Kazakhstan lie some of the largest oil fields discovered anywhere in the last half-century. Inland from the water sits Tengiz, a field so vast it carries its own weight in the world's energy markets. And out in the shallow northern water lies Kashagan, one of the most difficult oil fields ever developed, buried under a freezing, ice-bound sea, its oil laced with poison gas under crushing pressure. It took decades and tens of billions of dollars to coax it into production. This is why Kazakhstan, like its neighbors, fought so hard over the seabed. Nearly a third of the Caspian coastline is Kazakh, and beneath it lies a fortune. But Kazakhstan's coast is also the shallowest and the most fragile. It is here, in the north and the east, that the retreating water is exposing the most ground. The same nation that holds the richest offshore fields is watching the sea pull away from its shore faster than anywhere else. The prize and the loss sit on the same coastline. Now cross to the far eastern shore, to the strangest coastline of them all. Turkmenistan meets the Caspian with desert. The Karakum sands run almost to the water's edge, and behind the coast rise the Yangikala canyons, cliffs of pink and white and ochre carved by a sea that is no longer there. This was all underwater once. The rock still remembers it. But the strangest thing on this shore is a gulf that drinks the sea. It is called Garabogazköl, a vast, shallow bay on the eastern edge, connected to the main sea by a narrow channel barely a few hundred meters wide. And through that channel, the Caspian flows in and never flows back. The bay sits in the heart of the desert, under a relentless sun. The water that pours into it evaporates almost as fast as it arrives. So the channel pulls more in, endlessly, a river running from the sea into a basin that swallows it whole. What is left behind is salt. Geological is so saline that almost nothing can live in it. The bay is, in effect, a machine for turning seawater into mineral, a slow, vast salt pan fed by the sea itself. The Caspian is Turkmenistan's only coast, its single window onto a wider world, for a nation that has otherwise sealed itself off almost completely. On the shore stands the port of Turkmenbashi, renamed after the country's first president, who renamed a great many things after himself. Behind it lies the desert and the silence of one of the most closed countries on Earth. Along that same coast, the Akau horses have been bred for 3,000 years. Tall, lean animals with coats that catch the light like beaten metal, the national pride of Turkmenistan. They are among the most ancient horse breeds still living, valued for their endurance across the very deserts that run down to this sea. Desert, horse, and water meeting at the edge of a country few outsiders ever see. It is a perfect image of the whole Caspian, a body of water with no way out, losing itself to the sky, one drop at a time. And that image is about to become the heart of the story. Because before we reach the place where 5 nations finally drew their line, there is one more shore to visit, the oldest of them all. On the western coast, where the Caucasus Mountains crowd down almost to the water, stands the city of Derbent. People have lived here, without pause, for thousands of years, longer than almost anywhere else in modern Russia. And the reason is geography. Here the mountains and the sea pinch together, leaving only a narrow gate of flat land between them. Everyone moving along the western Caspian, north or south, army or caravan, had to pass through this gap. So the people of Derbent built a wall across it, a great fortress, the citadel of Narin Kala, climbs the hill above the city, and from it 2 long walls once ran all the way down to the sea, sealing the gap, turning the entire coastline into a single guarded door. The Caspian Gates, they were called. For 1,500 years, empires fought over this one narrow strip, because whoever held Derbent held the road between 2 worlds. The land behind Derbent is one of the most tangled human landscapes on Earth. This is Dagestan, a Russian republic whose name means roughly the land of mountains, and whose mountains hold a density of languages found almost nowhere else. Dozens of distinct tongues are spoken across its valleys, some by only a few thousand people, each one walled off from the next by ridges too steep to cross. Conquerors came and went along the coast for 2,000 years. The peoples of the highlands stayed and kept their separate words. Derbent is where all of that funnels down to the sea, the meeting point of the mountains and the water, of empire and highland, of every road that ever ran along this shore. The walls still stand. The citadel still looks down over the rooftops and the water. And on the shore below the ancient city, in recent years, the people of Derbent have placed a very different kind of monument. A monster. It sits on the beach now, vast and grey and silent. Something that looks like an aircraft that grew too large to fly, half ship, half plane, stranded on the sand. It is called the Loon, and for a long time it was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. The Soviets called it an ekranoplan. The West, when its spy satellites first caught sight of the prototype skimming across the Caspian, did not know what it was. They had no name for a thing that size, moving that fast, just above the water. So they called it the Caspian Sea Monster. It is a ground effect machine. It does not sail, and it does not truly fly. It rides on a cushion of air trapped between its stubby wings and the surface of the sea, racing along just a few meters above the water at 550 kilometers an hour. It is longer than the largest passenger jet ever built. It was driven by 8 jet engines, and it carried 6 anti-ship missiles on its back, designed to come screaming low over the Caspian and strike before any radar could see it coming. 1987. The Loon enters service with the Soviet Caspian fleet. It is the only one of its kind ever finished. And then, a few years later, the country that built it ceased to exist. The Soviet Union dissolved, the money vanished, and the sea monster was left to rust at a naval base on this same shore, forgotten by almost everyone. A relic of an empire's ambition, slowly corroding in the salt air. July 2020. After 30 years, tugboats finally drag it free and tow it down the coast, to lie at last in the shadow of Durban's ancient walls, the newest monument beside the oldest city. A Cold War Leviathan beached beneath a 1,500-year-old fortress. But the Caspian is not a military backwater even now. The flotilla the Loon once belonged to is still here, and still has teeth. In 2015, the world was reminded of it. Russian warships sitting in the Caspian launched cruise missiles that flew nearly 1,500 kilometers across Iran and Iraq to strike targets in Syria. The missiles rose from an inland sea most of the world had forgotten was even navigable, and reached a war on the far side of the Middle East. It was a deliberate message. The Caspian is not a quiet pond in the corner of the map. It is a position, a place from which power can reach a long way. And the 5 nations on its shores have not stopped arming it. Joint exercises, new vessels, growing fleets. The agreement that would later keep outside navies off the water did nothing to slow the build-up among the 5 who remained. The sea that could not be divided peacefully is, year by year, more heavily defended. The monster on the beach at Durban is a relic, but what it represented never left the water. It is worth pausing on what that image really shows. The world spent the 20th century filing the Caspian away as a Soviet lake, a closed military zone behind the Iron Curtain, mapped and patrolled and largely ignored by everyone else. The monster on the beach is the wreck of that idea. The lake was never one country's, and when the empire that claimed it fell apart, it left 5 new neighbors staring at the same water, and a question no one had needed to answer before. Whose sea is this now? That question is the heart of everything, and answering it would take nearly 30 years. For most of the 20th century, the problem did not exist. There were only 2 countries on the Caspian, the Soviet Union and Iran. And in 2 treaties, signed in 1921 and 1940, they had agreed to share it between them. The water was, in effect, a common pond divided by 2. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union shattered into pieces. Where there had been one country on the northern and eastern shores, Suddenly, there were four. Russia remained, but now there was also an independent Azerbaijan, an independent Kazakhstan, an independent Turkmenistan, each one with its own coastline, its own ambitions, and its own claim to whatever lay beneath the water in front of it. The old treaties said nothing about how to divide an oil field on the seabed between 5 separate nations. They had never needed to. And so the argument began, and it turned immediately on that one impossible word: sea or lake. It was never an academic question. Each definition handed the prize to different countries. Call it a lake, and international custom leans toward an equal split. 5 nations, 5 equal shares, 20% each, regardless of how long your coast is or how little. Call it a sea, and the global law of the sea applies. You measure out from each country's coastline. The nations with long, sprawling shores would carve out enormous zones. The nations with short coasts would be left with far less. So the positions hardened, each country reaching for the definition that served it best. Iran, with the shortest coastline of the 5, wanted the equal split, or better still, a sea owned by all 5 together, its riches shared in common. The newer nations, sitting on the richest offshore oil fields, wanted the sea law that would let them claim what lay directly off their own coasts. Russia drifted between the two, guarding above all its right to keep warships on the water and to control what was built across it. And so the line was never drawn. The decades passed. Oil companies waited. Pipelines were proposed and abandoned. Navies shadowed each other across disputed waters, and more than once, ships from rival nations faced off over oil fields that 2 countries both claimed. The richest inland sea on Earth sat in legal limbo for a generation because 5 nations could not agree what to call it. And then, in the summer of 2018, they came to the small Kazakh port of Aktau, the same coast where the caviar had vanished from the shops, and they signed. August 2018. The presidents of Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan put their names to a single document: the Convention on the Legal Status of the Caspian Sea. 22 years in the making, and the answer they gave to the great question was the strangest answer of all. It is not a lake, and it is not a sea. The convention invented a third thing: a special legal status that belongs to the Caspian alone and to nothing else on Earth. The surface of the water, they agreed, would be treated something like a sea, shared, open to all 5 for navigation and fishing beyond a coastal band, free water that belongs to everyone. But the seabed, the floor beneath, where the oil and the gas actually lie, would be divided like a lake. Carved into national zones, each country taking the ground in front of its own coast. Common water above, divided ground below. They had answered the riddle by refusing to choose. The Caspian would be a sea on top and a lake on the bottom, both and neither, forever. And here's the part the headlines mostly missed. For all its ceremony, the convention left the single hardest question unanswered. It set the principle: the seabed gets divided. But it did not draw the lines. Exactly where one nation's floor ends and another's begins, in the contested south, where Azerbaijan, Iran, and Turkmenistan all reached toward the same oil fields, was left for those countries to settle later, among themselves, field by field. The convention did not divide the Caspian. It agreed, after 22 years, on how the Caspian might one day be divided. The richest and most disputed fields are still to this day unsettled. And those unsettled fields are not abstract lines on a map. In 2001, in the southern Caspian, an Iranian gunboat confronted a survey ship working an oil field that both Iran and Azerbaijan claimed, and ordered it out of the water at gunpoint. Exploration there stopped for years. The field, rich and contested, still sits in limbo, claimed by two nations who have never agreed where one country's seabed ends and the other's begins. It is the convention's unfinished business, drawn in miniature. The five agreed on the principle. They left the hardest borders, the ones with the most oil and the longest history of mistrust, for some later day that has not yet come. The map of the Caspian, even now, has lines that simply stop in open water. And one clause mattered more than all the oil. The five nations agreed that no outside military would ever be allowed onto the Caspian, only their own navies. The warships skimming this water would only ever fly one of 5 flags. The sea monster's descendants would stay in the family. And the convention touched at last on the question that had haunted the whole dispute: the pipelines. For years there had been a dream, a pipeline laid across the floor of the Caspian, carrying the gas of Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan west through Azerbaijan onto Europe. A line that would loosen Russia's grip on the gas that Europe burned. Russia and Iran had blocked it for decades, raising the alarm over the danger such a pipeline might pose to the sea. The convention shifted the ground beneath that argument. Now, it said, a pipeline across the seabed needed the consent only of the countries whose floor it crossed, not all 5. On paper, the road to a trans-Caspian pipeline had opened. In practice, the politics of the sea, and now its shrinking, kept the dream where it had always been, just out of reach, beneath the contested water. So the line was finally almost drawn. The argument that had outlasted the Soviet Union was, after a fashion, put to rest.
But something had changed while they argued.
Something none of the 5 had been watching closely enough. The sea they had spent 30 years dividing was beginning to disappear. Remember the door. The Caspian has only one way to lose water, into the air, and for the last 3 decades, it has been losing it faster than the rivers can replace it. The numbers are difficult to absorb. Since the mid-1990s, the surface of the Caspian has been falling. From 2006 to today, it has dropped by more than 2 meters. It now sits at the lowest level ever reliably recorded, and the fall is speeding up. Satellite measurements show the level dropping by around 7 centimeters every year, roughly 20 times faster than the world's oceans are rising. In less than 2 decades, the sea has lost an area of surface larger than many entire countries. The causes are the old familiar ones: a warming climate that pulls more water into the sky, rivers that carry less than they used to, dammed and drawn down upstream before they ever reach the coast. The Volga itself, the great artery, arriving thinner than before. And because the northern Caspian is so shallow, in many places only a few meters deep, even a small drop in level pulls the shoreline back enormous distances. In the north, the water has already retreated tens of kilometers from where it used to lap. The maps the 5 nations argued over are out of date before the ink is dry. Scientists studying the basin warn that if the trend holds, the sea could fall by many meters more before this century is out, and lose as much as 1/3 of its surface. The shallow northern third, where the seals breed and the sturgeons spawn, could very nearly vanish. This has happened before, within living memory, just to the east. The Aral Sea, the Caspian's smaller cousin, another fragment of the same vanished ocean, was once the fourth largest lake on Earth. Then the rivers feeding it were drained for cotton. In a single generation, it shrank to almost nothing, leaving fishing boats stranded on dry salt and ships rusting in a desert that used to be a seabed. The people of the Caspian have seen what the end of an inland sea looks like. It is not an abstraction to them. It is a warning, written in the sand a few hundred kilometers away. And so the cruel arithmetic comes clear. As the water retreats, the dry seabed it exposes is not clean. A century of oil and heavy industry has left its residue in the sediment. The wind lifts it, salt and dust, and the ghosts of old pollution, and carries it inland in storms that coat the towns and burn the lungs of the people who live there. In Aktau, the desalination plant that gives the city its drinking water struggles as the shoreline pulls away from its intake pipes. In the north, the shallow nurseries where the last sturgeons spawn are drying out. The Caspian seal, the Arctic refugee, finds its breeding ice gone and its breeding grounds turning to mudflat. Studies estimate that even a modest fall in the sea would erase most of the places it needs to survive. The sturgeon that outlived the dinosaurs, the seal that outlived an ice age, the ancient survivors of a 50-million-year-old ocean. They came through everything, and now the water itself is leaving from under them. There is a bitter symmetry to it. For 30 years, 5 nations fought over how to divide this sea. They finally agreed, in 2018, on the shape of the answer. And in almost exactly those same years, the thing they were dividing began to vanish. They drew their lines across the water at the precise moment the water started to withdraw beneath them.
Not everyone has looked away.
Along the Kazakh coast, environmental lawyers and ecologists have begun to organize campaigns to save the Caspian, to hold the oil industry to account, to force the 5 governments to treat the sea as something more than a map of mineral rights. They are small voices against very large interests, but they are the first to insist on the obvious, that a divided sea is still one sea, that a line on the seabed means nothing if there is no water left above it. And it is the people of the shore who will feel it first. The fishermen of the Volga Delta, working a sea that holds fewer fish each year. The families of Aktau, watching their beach widen into mudflat and their water supply grow uncertain. The villages along the Iranian coast, where the catch that fed generations has thinned. None of them drew the lines. None of them sat at the table in Aktau. They simply live on the edge of the water, as their families have for centuries, and they watch it draw away. A sea divided on paper is still, to the people who depend on it, just the water they have always known. And it is leaving. And perhaps that is the truest thing the Caspian has to teach. It has been, in turn, an ocean, and a refuge, and a fortune, and a battleground. Marco Polo's burning springs, the first oil well in the world, the half of the world's oil that lit the lamps of an empire, the tigers and the sturgeon and the small Arctic seal, the Cold War monster on the beach below a 1,500-year-old wall, the 5 flags, and the line no one could draw. All of it rests on a body of water that is, by the strictest measure, neither a sea nor a lake, a piece of a vanished ocean, marooned in the heart of a continent that 5 nations finally agreed to share. The question that opened all of this still has no clean answer. Is it a sea Or is it a lake? Maybe the better question now is the one the 5 nations spent 30 years avoiding while the level fell. Not whose sea is it, but how much of it will still be here when they finally finish dividing it up. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey, take a breath and stay a while.